Hi, Kevin Gibbon with you once again, and welcome to Comics Let's Talk. Before we begin our show, if you love comics as much as I do, you're going to subscribe to my channel. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe! Last week we looked at Conan the Barbarian in the world of comic books. This week, I want to continue my look at the world of sword and sorcery in the medium of comic books. We saw that Robert E. Howard was the originator of the genre, even if he himself did not coin the term. Sword and sorcery is a subgenre of fantasy characterized by sword-wielding heroes engaged in exciting and violent adventures. An element of romance is often present, as is an element of magic and the supernatural. Unlike works of high fantasy, the tales, though dramatic, focus mainly on personal battles rather than world-endangering matters. Sword and sorcery commonly overlaps with heroic fantasy. The term sword and sorcery was coined in 1961 by the British author Michael Moorcock, who published a letter in the fanzine Amra demanding a name for the sort of fantasy adventure story written by Robert E. Howard. He had initially proposed the term epic fantasy. However, the celebrated American sword and sorcery author Fritz Leiber replied to the journal Anklegon in 1961, suggesting sword and sorcery as a good popular catchphrase for the field. He expanded on this in the issue of Amra, commenting, "I feel more certain than ever that this field should be called Sword and Sorcery Story. This accurately describes the points of culture level and supernatural element, and also immediately distinguishes it from the Cloak and Sword historical adventure story, and, quite incidentally, from the Cloak and Dagger international espionage stories too." Since its inception, many attempts have been made to provide a precise definition of sword and sorcery. Although many have debated the finer points, the consensus characterizes it by a strong bias toward fast-paced, action-rich tales within a quasi-mythical or fantastical framework. Unlike high fantasy, the stakes in sword and sorcery tend to be personal, the danger confined to the moment of telling. Settings are typically exotic and protagonists often morally compromised. Sword and sorcery ultimately draw from the mythology and classical epics, such as Homer's Odyssey, the Norse sagas, and Arthurian legend. It is also influenced by historical fiction, for instance that of Sir Walter Scott, which was influenced by Scottish folklore and ballads. However, very few of Scott's stories contain fantastic elements. In most, the appearance of such is explained away. However, its themes of adventure in a strange society influenced the adventures set in foreign lands by H. Rider Haggard and Edgar Rice Burroughs. Haggard's works included many fantastic elements. Sword and sorcery's immediate progenitors are the swashbuckling tales of Axel Dumas, the Three Musketeers, etc., Raphael Sabatini, Scaramouche, etc., and their pulp magazine imitators, such as Talbot Mundy, Harold Lamb, and H. Bedford Jones, who all influenced Robert E. Howard. However, these historical swashbucklers lack the truly supernatural element, even though Dumas' fiction contained many fantasy tropes that defines the genre. Another influence was early fantasy fiction such as Lord Dunsany's The Fortress Unvanquishable, save for Sankoth, and A. Merritt's The Ship of Ishtar. All of these authors influenced sword and sorcery for their plots, characters, and landscapes used. In addition, many early sword and sorcery writers, such as Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith, were heavily influenced by the Middle Eastern tales of the Arabian Nights, whose stories of magical monsters and evil sorcerers were a major influence on the genre to be. Sword and sorcery's frequent depictions of smoky taverns and smelly back alleys draw upon the picaresque genre. For example, Rachel Bingham notes that Fritz Leiber's city of Lankhmar bears considerable similarity to 16th century Seville as depicted in Cervantes' tale of Cortadillo. Sword and sorcery proper only truly began in the pulp fantasy magazines where it emerged from weird fiction. Particularly important was the magazine Weird Tales, which published Howard's Conan stories and C.L. Moore's Jirel of Jory tales, as well as key sword and sorcery influences like Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith. From the 1960s up until the 1980s, under the guiding force of Lynn Carter, a select group of writers formed the Swordsmen and Sorcerers Guild of America, SAGA, to promote and enlarge the sword and sorcery genre. From 1973 to 1981, 5 anthologies featuring short works by SAGA members were published. Edited by Carter, these were collectively known as Flashing Swords. Because of these and other anthologies, such as the Ballantine Adult Fantasy series, his own fiction and his criticism Carter is considered one of the most important popularizers of genre fantasy in general, and Sword and Sorcery in particular. Another notable Sword and Sorcery anthology series that ran from 1977 through 1979 was called Swords Against Darkness from Zebra Books, edited by Andra J. Upwood. The series ran to 5 volumes and featured stories by such authors as Poul Anderson, David Drake, Ramsey Campbell, Andre Norton, and Manly Wade Wellman. Despite such authors' best efforts, Sword and Sorcery has more colloquially come to be known as a catch-all phrase for low-grade derivative fantasy. During the 1980s, influenced by the success of the 1982 feature film Conan the Barbarian, many cheaply made fantasy films were released in a subgenre that would be called Sword and Sorcery. The term is sometimes used in a derogatory manner by writers and readers of the fantasy genre. After the boom of the early 80s, Sword and Sorcery once again dropped out of favor with epic fantasy, largely taking its place in the fantasy genre. However, there was another resurgence in Sword and Sorcery at the end of the 20th century, sometimes called the New or Literary Sword and Sorcery. This development places emphasis on literary techniques and draws from epic fantasy and other genres to broaden the typical scope of Sword and Sorcery. Stories may feature the wide-ranging struggles, national or world-spanning concerns common to high fantasy, but told from the point of view of characters more common to Sword and Sorcery, and with a sense of adventure common to the latter. Writers associated with this include Stephen Erickson, Joe Abercrombie, and Scott Lynch. Magazines such as Black Gate and the e-zines Flashing Swords, not to be confused with the Lynn Carter anthologies, and Beneath Ceaseless Skies publish short fiction in the style. These authors and editors are attempting to return the genre to the status it enjoyed during the pulp era of the 20s and 30s. Despite the importance of C.L. Moore, Lee Brackett, Andre Norton, and other female authors, as well as Moore's early heroine, Sword and Sorcery has been categorized as having a strongly masculine bias. Female characters were generally distressed damsels to be rescued or protected, or otherwise served as inducement or reward for a male hero's adventures. Women who had adventures of their own often did so to counter the threat of rape or to gain revenge of same. Marion Zimmer Bradley's Sword and Sorceress anthology series, from 1984 onwards, attempted the reverse. Bradley encouraged female writers and protagonists. The stories featured skillful swordswomen and powerful sorceresses, working from a variety of motives. Jessica Amanda Salmonson similarly sought to broaden the range of roles for female characters in Sword and Sorcery through both her own stories and in editing the World Fantasy award-winning Amazons, from 1979, and Amazons 2, from 1982. Those anthologies both drew on real and folkloric women warriors, often from areas outside of Europe. Early Sword and Sorcerer writer Robert E. Howard had feminist views, which he espoused in both personal and professional life. He wrote to his friends and associates defending the achievements and capabilities of women. Strong female characters in Howard's works of fiction include Dark Agnes de Chistillon, who first appeared in Swordwomen, circa 32 to 34, the early modern pirate Helen Tavral, The Isle of Pirates, Doom, 1928, as well as 2 pirates and Conan the Barbarian supporting characters, Belit and Valeria of the Red Brotherhood. Introduced as the co-star in a non-fantasy historical story by Howard, The Shadow of the Vulture, Red Sonja of Rocatino would later inspire a fantasy heroine named Red Sonja, who first appeared in the comic book series Conan the Barbarian, written by Roy Thomas and illustrated by Barry Windsor Smith. Red Sonja received her own comic book title and eventually a series of novels by David C. Smith and Richard L. Tierney, as well as Richard Fleischer's unsuccessful film adaptation in 1985. From Charles Rutledge. The subtitle The Barbarian has been used before, as far back as 1950 in a series called Crom the Barbarian. Crom is, of course, the name of the god Conan worships, and this character was created and written by comics great Gardner Fox, a writer well-versed in the pulps. Crom, a sort of blonde Conan, made his first 2 appearances in the pages of the Avon pulp magazine Out of This World. Along with traditional prose fiction, the magazine included 32-page color comics inserts. The stories were later reprinted in Avon comic book Strange Worlds. In 1955, the first issue of DC Comics anthology titled The Brave and the Bold appeared on the stands. Brave and the Bold #1 contains stories of 3 historical adventure characters: the Silent Knight, the Golden Gladiator, and the Viking Prince. Viking Prince, originally written by Bob Kanigher and illustrated by Joe Kubert, was the breakout character, getting most of the covers and taking over the comic entirely for 2 issues, before The Brave and the Bold became a tryout book much like Showcase. Though originally conceived as an historical adventure, the Viking Prince fought monsters, magicians, and villains of every type, firmly fitting him into the Sword and Sorcery category. On an odd note, the Prince took part in one of the strangest team-ups in comic book history. He showed up in our army at war at number 162, joining forces with Sergeant Rock and the combat-happy Joes of East Company. The Prince had been been somehow frozen in ice and was thawed out just in time to help Rock fight the Nazis. They just don't make comics like that anymore. Another barbarian appearing in 1976 in a Harvey anthology comic with the somewhat daunting title of Unearthly Spectaculars, issue number 1, featured Clawfang the Barbarian, a post-apocalyptic tale of warriors and monsters, beautifully illustrated by Al Williamson. Clawfang the Barbarian is the product of Wally Wood on story and Al Williamson on art, and a lovelier post-apocalyptic society returns to barbarism, but there are still super scientific lab parts floating around, stories there possibly never has before been. From the Gone and Forgotten blog, although he only ever appeared once in Unearthly Spectaculars number 2, December of '66, Clawfang packs a lot of detail in his single outing, the result of a barbarian society which emerges after a devastating nuclear war, which itself was the product of society rebuilding itself after a devastating nuclear war, and so on, as though it were turtles all the way down. Clawfang leads a desperate band of raiders against the all-consuming empire of the cat-like Felina. Well, they say she's cat-like. She just looks like the 60s glamour girl for some reason. And this is from CBR.com and the 10 greatest fantasy comics of all time. Their take on Kull the Conqueror. When Marvel experienced great success publishing Conan comics, the company turned to Howard's other creation, Kull, to provide fans with more badass barbarism. Brought to Marvel in 1971's Creatures on the Loose number 10 by Howard scholar Roy Thomas and unparalleled fantasy artist Bernie Wrightson, Kull found a home at Marvel through the 70s and 80s, becoming an ever-present part of the company's publishing plans. Kull appeared in frequent backups in Conan's black and white magazines, 4 volumes of his own solo series, and a short-lived black and white magazine called Kull and the Barbarians that featured some insanely primal art and pure Howard-esque storytelling. In a special moment of Bronze Age insanity, Kull even appeared in 1981's Marvel Team-Up number 112 and sort of met Spider-Man. With the ancient setting where men were still drying themselves off from crawling out of the slime of creation. Kull's stories had a very H.P. Lovecraft feel of ancient monsters and unknowable evils. While physically looking a great deal like Conan, Kull was his own man, one who had to tame a world that was not ready for humanity or civilization. Kull is now published by Dark Horse Comics, who publishes periodic miniseries featuring the adventure. He might be lesser known than Conan, but Kull is no second banana. He is a classic barbarian who carries the same action and tonality that made the genre so popular. His first appearance was the Shadow Kingdom in Weird Tales, August 1929. Kull has been adapted to comics by Marvel Comics with 3 series between 1971 and 1985. The first was drawn by Marie Severin and her brother John Severin. He also appeared several times in the Savage Sword of Conan series. Another graphic novel, Kull, The Veil of Shadow, was published in 1989. In 2006, Dark Horse Comics bought the rights to use Kull for a new ongoing series, the first issue to be based on the Shadow Kingdom, and as of 2012, 3 miniseries were published. Kull, Kull the Hate Witch, and Kull the Cat in the Skull. Kull was portrayed in the 1997 movie Kull the Conqueror by actor Kevin Sorbo. This film was originally intended to be a Conan film, and some elements of this remain. The story's basis and several names can be directly traced to the Conan story, The Hour of the Dragon. The 1982 Conan the Barbarian film, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, borrowed many elements from Howard's Kull stories. The main villain, Thulsa Doom, was from the Kull series, as was the Serpent Cult. Conan's early life as a slave and gladiator in the movie borrows heavily from Kull's origin story and only shares minor details with Conan's literary origins. Conan was never a slave or a gladiator in Howard's stories and left Cimmeria on his own will. The original Marvel run began in 1971 and lasted for 29 issues. There were 3 black and white magazines from 1975 called Kull and the Barbarians. There were 2 issues of a second series in 1982, and finally a third series that consisted of 10 issues in 1983 to 1985. Dark Horse then acquired the rights to publish Kull stories, giving us several miniseries. Chronicles of Kull, 2009 to 2012, Kull, 2008, Kull Bust, 2008, Dark Horse Deluxe, The Savage Sword Collection, Kull the Cat in the Skull, 2011, Kull the Hate Witch, 2010, and in 2009 we had Kull trade paperback come out. 2010 to 2011 gave us Savage Sword of Kull. Dagger the Invincible was Gold Key's answer to the sword and sorcery genre, first appearing in 1972 and giving us 18 issues. Dagger was the last survivor of the nation of Tulgonia, and other Tulgonians having been wiped out by the armies of the evil Scorpio. He spent his life training for vengeance and set out to be a mercenary swordsman. Mistrustful of humanity, he swore to fight only for pay. But as it turned out, Dagger had a kinder heart than he thought, and he ended up saving folks whether they could pay him or not. Don Bluth was one of the first writers to try and bring some Marvel DC style continuity to Gold Key. And while his Dagger stories did tend to be complete in one issue, he still carried plot threads over from story to story and managed to link Dagger to some other Gold Key titles, including Dr. Spectre and Trag and the Sky Gods. Trag was a caveman hero who got involved with extraterrestrials. Adam Spectre was a parapsychologist who fought supernatural menaces. The Dagger stories are full of monsters, magic, and maidens, and they really deserve to be reprinted. Writer Don Bluth remembers how the character came to be from the Sword and Sorcery website. Sword and Sorcery was hot at the time, so I thought I'd try my hand at writing a Sword and Sorcery story. So I pitched a short story for Mystery Comics Digest featuring a hero called with the name Dagger. It wasn't meant to be the start of a series, but the editor bought it, and the character was officially born. Then I wrote a second Dagger story for MCD, which the editor also bought. Then he called me up, and this is before either of the stories had yet seen print, and told me he thought an actual book featuring the character was a good idea. There were two problems. First, he didn't like the name. Second, there were still those two short stories that had yet to see publication. He didn't think it appropriate that these two short stories should appear in the digest after the debut of the actual book starring the character, and I saw his point. So while he tinkered around with various other names for Dagger, he changed the name of the MCD hero to Duroc, which later, because it rhymed with Turok, got changed again to Duroc, who I later had meet both Dagger and Dr. Spectre. At one point, I wrote a synopsis for the original story in which I called the character Shar, a name that was also shot down. Finally, my editor called me up and said the series character would be spelled D-A-G-A-R, Dagger. I kind of like that, because as I was not yet certain that I'd get name credit in the book, Dagger contained both of my initials, D-G. And by the way, the official title of the book, which I fought against, was Tales of Sword and Sorcery. The Gold Key editors really liked those Tales of titles, but almost everyone ended up calling the book Dagger anyway. At least, that's what I like to believe. Bluth had a second barbarian character at Gold Key named Duroc, who appeared in 3 stories in Spine-Tingling Tales issue 3, a special Sword and Sorcery issue, and who sometimes turned up in the pages of Dagger as well. In a nifty crossover in issue 16 of Dr. Spectre, Duroc traveled to the future fight alongside the good doctor against the evil wizard Zorkon and the Frankenstein monster, Shades of the Viking Prince. Red Sonja. With Conan, Marvel visualized the most iconic character in the fantasy literature and created the archetypical barbarian. With Red Sonja, the House of Ideas did it again. They just switched genders. Writer Roy Thomas took the name Red Sonja from Howard's creation Red Sonja of Rogantino and gave it to his flame-haired Hellion, Red Sonja of Hyrcania. In doing so, Thomas created the most enduring female fantasy character in comics history. From her chainmail bikini to her scarlet tresses, Red Sonja slashed her way to popularity in the mid-70s, appearing as a regular backup feature in Conan's Black and White magazine, as well as appearing as a frequent guest star in Kull's titles before finally earning her own solo book. Sonja's origin was mature and adult storytelling, her tragic past forming a woman every bit as deadly and capable as Conan and Kull. Sonja was a living weapon, prone to even more violence than some of the other warriors Howard created. Sonja can currently be found kicking ass in books published by Dynamite Entertainment, where a new generation of readers can experience fantasy's deadliest woman. Between 1977 and 1986, there were various Red Sonja titles published by Marvel, including an adaptation of the movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Bridget Nielsen. Blackthorn Comics did a one-shot with Red Sonja in 1988. Cross Plains did a Roy Thomas story with Death and Scarlet in 1999. Then the rights to Red Sonja went to Dynamite in 2005, up until the present day, giving us several series and crossovers, including DC's Wildstorm imprint with a Red Sonja crossover story in 2006 called Claw, Devil Hands. She would also team up with Marvel's Spider-Man and Dark Horse's Conan, and on down the road, she would team up with Tarzan. Dynamite also gave us another Sword and Sorcery heroine when they adapted the television series Xena, Warrior Princess. The title Sword of Sorcery was an American Sword and Sorcery comics anthology featuring Fard and the Grey Mouser, heroes and rogues created by Fritz Lieber. Published bi-monthly by DC Comics, it ran for 5 issues in 1973 with a cover price of 20 cents. The title was written by Denny O'Neil and featured art by Howard Chaykin, Walt Simonson, and Jim Starlin. In June of 2012, the series returned with a revival of Amethyst, Princess of Gemworld by writer Christy Marks and artist Aaron Lopresti. The title included a backup feature starring Beowulf, written by Tony Bedard and drawn by Jesus Sai. From Mark Buxton and Den of Geek, Obviously, the book failed to catch on as it was part of DC's recent spate of cancellations. Unlike Fury of Firestorm, Deathstroke, and some of the other ill-fated titles, creative disorganization wasn't to blame for Sword and Sorcery getting the axe, as writer Christy Marks put her all into Amethyst's adventures. Marks not only created interesting characters in Amethyst and her mother, the former wielder of the power of Gemworld, but also did the one thing all successful writers of fantasy must do. She was able to engage in world building. The rules and character hierarchies of Gemworld were clear, and Marks was able to get her points across without clumsy exposition. Amethyst had a clear purpose, setting, conflict, and direction. While there were some growing pains, they were to be expected, as Marks is a relative newcomer to comics. The world-building need in any successful fantasy series may be the very thing that brought the book down. At $3.99 a pop, fans might not have had the patience to wait around while the creative team actually builds the world. Ask any Game of Thrones fan. There is as much time spent on the backgrounds and history of Westeros as there is with the protagonists of the series. Modern comic fans are used to lightning-paced narratives. Superheroes excel at moving stories along at a brisk pace. Introduction, conflict, fight, resolution, consequence is the formula most superhero stories take and have taken for decades. This is not a slight, as writers like Scott Snyder, Jeff Lemire, Jonathan Hickman, Dan Slott, and Jeff Johns consistently craft masterful stories using this formula. But a good fantasy tale must build the history and rules of the world before any sort of conflict or resolution has an ounce of perspective or meaning. In the mid-70s, DC tried to bank off the successes of Marvel's Conan by introducing their own line of fantasy heroes. Most didn't last very long, but there were plenty of cool, original characters and concepts introduced. Claw, Tor, Starfire, Beowulf, and the Stalker were all introduced, and just as quickly disappeared. In the midst of this diverse group of failed characters came the Warlord, and this time, DC had a bona fide fantasy hit on their hands. Warlord is the tale of Travis Morgan, a Vietnam vet who gets lost in the primordial world of Scartaris, a world very reminiscent of Edgar Rice Burroughs' lost world of Pellucidar. The book hit all the familiar fantasy tropes as Morgan gained staunch allies, made bitter enemies, and hung out with the scantily clad princesses as he fought to save his new home, all the while trying to find a way to return to his native Earth. Mike Grell's stunning artwork and portrayal of Morgan made the book successful for years. Grell rendered beautiful women with the same eye for detail as the book's slobbering beasties, and Morgan conquered them both. Warlord was a throwback to pulpy fantasies of old, but the concepts and characters endure. Fans can rest assured that the Warlord should fight again someday. From the Sword and Sorcery website, a brief history of Sword and Sorcery comics, also from Charles Rutledge. The cover of DC Comics Showcase number 82 from May 1969 actually bills that issue's Nightmaster story as beginning a great new Sword and Sorcery saga. Nightmaster was a sword-wielding hero who wore superheroish blue tights and adventured in an alternate dimension. Issues 82 through 84 of Showcase featured some of the earliest work of fan favorite Bernie Wrightson. Gil Kane's Blackmark was a sword and sorcery hero who was conceived before Conan reached the comics, but not actually published until afterwards. Blackmark, another post-apocalyptic saga, was begun around 1968. Created, plotted, and illustrated by Kane with script by Archie Goodwin. The story follows the adventures of a genetically altered hero who fights evil in the distant future. Blackmark's saga was originally supposed to appear as a series of mass-market paperbacks. However, only one volume was printed in 1971. Later chapters of Blackmark showed up in Marvel's black and white magazine, The Savage Sword of Conan. This was fitting because Kane reportedly had sought the rights to produce a Conan comic several years before Marvel, and he would go on to be considered one of Marvel's classic Conan artists. All of Kane's Blackmark work is reprinted in a trade paperback from Fantagraphic Books. Roy Thomas and Barry Smith did a short Conan tryout pages of Chamber of Darkness number 4. This story, titled The Sword and the Sorcerers, featured a Conan lookalike called Star the Slayer. The plot involves a sword and sorcery writer named Len Carson, who was apparently based on Lynn Carter, who has an unfortunate run-in with one of his own characters. This story was reprinted in Conan issue 16 and also appears in the Marvel Essential Conan collection. Thinking that the rights to Conan, who had been enjoying brisk paperback sales, might be too expensive, Roy Thomas initially looked into getting Lynn Carter's Thongor of Lemuria. While Thongor did eventually become a comic book series, appearing in 1973 for 6 issues of Marvel's tryout title, Creatures on the Loose, Roy was able to get the rights to turn Conan into a comics hero at that time, and the rest is history. Solomon Kane, Howard's Puritan adventurer, never made it to the big leagues. He starred in issues 33 and 34 of Marvel Premiere, and then later in his own 6-issue miniseries in 1980. He did much better with the Dark Horse run. Claw was DC Comics' most obvious attempt to emulate Conan. Aside from the red metal gauntlet that hid his beast-like namesake, Claw was pretty much a Conan clone, from his long black mane to his somewhat shaggy loincloth. The initial issues even featured art by Ernie Chan, one of the most frequent inkers on the Color Conan title. Claw ran for 12 issues. The adventures of Claw, whose real name was Valkan, took place in the realm of Pytheria, in a vaguely defined setting which resembled Earth's prehistory. His first adventure pitted him against Oculus of the Yellow Eye, an evil sorcerer and king who was revealed to have murdered Claw's father, but also had a deformed hand like his son. Oculus had received a prophecy which predicted that a claw-handed man would defeat him. That prophecy became his reason for persecuting Valkan and his father. Claw's origin was revealed in issue number 9, where Valkan learns that his family is cursed to have demon hands throughout their bloodline as a result of a deal his father made with demons. In later stories, it was revealed that Claw existed in the same world, Pytheria, as the original Starfire, which is apparently not Earth. Both Starfire and Claw were revealed as two of the eternal champions of the Sornai. The implications of this revelation were never explored, unfortunately, as the series ended in a cliffhanger. Then we come to Stalker. As his subtitle says, he was a man whose soul had been stolen. His quest was to get it back, of course. Stalker was written by Paul Levitz and drawn by the impressive art team of Steve Ditko on pencils and Wally Wood on inks. Another somewhat odd DC attempt at Sword and Sorcery that came out in 1975 was Beowulf, Dragon Slayer. Yes, that Beowulf. Apparently comics fans weren't big on British literature, and Beowulf barely managed to stay on the stands for a year, which was more than could be said for Kong and Stalker. British fantasy author Michael Moorcock is probably best known for his stories of the multiverse, a series of alternate realities in which various incarnations of the eternal champion fight to obtain balance against the forces of law and chaos. It's fitting, then, that the comic book career of Moorcock's most famous hero, Elric the Albino, is almost as complex as the multiverse itself. Within just a couple of years, in the early 1980s, Pacific Comics, Marvel Comics, and First Comics published Elric. He finally settled at First for a series of adaptations of Moorcock's novels. Roy Thomas wrote the adaptations, and P. Craig Russell is the artist most associated with Elric in the comics. The edge of the multiverse seems like a good place to bring this history to a stop. This article is far from all-inclusive. During the writing, I learned that Dark Horse had published a 4-issue miniseries in 1990 featuring Robert E. Howard's Cormac McCards. From 1975, the short-lived Atlas Comics gave us 2 sword-wielding barbarians. From the Atlas Archives. The first of the Atlas sword-slinging characters, Ironjaw, roams the world in Earth's distant post-apocalyptic future. He's a violent, amoral wanderer who lives for battle. Hired by rebels to help overthrow a tyrannical king, Ironjaw discovers his true heritage. When he was an infant, his mother's lover killed Ironjaw's father, the true king, and ascended to the throne himself. With the complicity of the queen, the new king ordered the infant killed, since he would inherit throne and depose the usurper upon reaching adulthood. A soft-hearted stable hand abandoned the infant on a snowy mountainside rather than kill him. After killing the tyrant king, Ironjaw, identified by his distinctive birthmark as the true heir to the throne, is crowned king. Upon discovering to his dismay that a king cannot fight or hunt or steal or chase wenches, Ironjaw chooses to slip away in the middle of the night, abandoning his new kingdom to resume his wanderer's ways. After a personality-altering interlude in the Barbarians #1, Ironjaw returns in this 4th and final issue with the first part of his long-awaited origin story, the tale of how the abandoned infant became the warrior. From a comic-a-day karaoke fanboy, Ironjaw isn't the unfortunate consequence of a regretful night in Amsterdam. Ironjaw is the most macho comic book I've ever read. I'm not talking about tough guy macho, as I've recently analyzed in Cobb and The Fist of God, but barbarian macho. The rare combination of strength and confidence one could only find in the heart of a warrior from a post-apocalyptic future. Meet Ironjaw. He'll rescue your village from plunderers for the thrill of the battle, and expect your woman to thank him accordingly. He is the future of mankind. In the spirit of the mighty Samson, Ironjaw takes place on a future Earth nearly destroyed by the recklessness of humanity. Tyrants rule with an iron fist, challenged by a band of rebels with steely resolve. Ironjaw is in a class of his own, and from the first act of this introductory issue, in which he rescues a woman from her and her elderly father, who probably dies anyway, from a band of marauders, one of whom escapes and tells his king of the warrior's skill, not to mention his distinctive birthmark that indicates his hidden royal lineage. When a young shepherd finds Ironjaw and his new wench secluded in a cave, the kid reports the rebels' location to the king, who puts a bounty on their heads and soon sees them captured. Ironjaw's sister visits him and, unaware of his origins, believes her to be a last meal, and although she rejects his Luke Leia-like advances, she leaves him a knife and he effortlessly escapes. Outside the castle walls, Ironjaw remembers, "I knew I forgot something. My blonde-haired wench is still imprisoned inside the dungeon. She is far too lovely for me to let her go so easily. I shall have to re-enter the castle and get her back." Ah, what a hero, right? Honestly, Ironjaw #1 contains some of the best lines I've read in a comic book in a long time. And by best, I mean hard to believe they were ever really written. Dripping with savage hubris, seasoned with the kind of sexism that would only be acceptable in a future where survival trumps respect. Ironjaw is a veritable fount of quotable wisdom. Truly the stuff seduction of the innocent tried to dissuade. Also from the Atlas Archives. On a nameless world, in a forgotten time, there lived a man called Wolf, orphaned 10 years ago when his parents, the king and queen, were slain in an ambush staged by trolls in the service of an evil sorcerer. Wolf has spent the last decade training for the day he would return to claim his birthright. After his trainer-mentor is killed by the same troll who killed his mother 10 years earlier, Wolf avenges his mother's death, reclaims his father's sword from the slain troll, and begins his long-awaited trip home. As Wolf rides homeward, with the intent to raise an army and raid the evil sorcerer's lair and free his hereditary kingdom, he encounters many magic-induced obstacles conjured by his foe. From Blogspot, the Bronze Age of blogs, Pete Dory. I always thought that Alice' other barbarian hero could have been a contender. He's not a complete Conan ripoff like DC's Kull the Conqueror, and there were glimmers of originality here, considering this is a Sword and Sorcery title we're talking about. I like the fact that it took place on a planet the size of which is beyond mortal comprehension. I like the brief looks at the rest of the world Wolf travels through. I like his mentor Stavro Darkoven, and the fact that Wolf spends his origin issue as a street popper. And I love Larry Hama and Klaus Jansson's artwork. Again, unlike Claw, Hama doesn't just look to Robert E. Howard for inspiration, but there's elements of Tolkien. And, in the second issue, even Fritz Leiber if you squint. Maybe I protest too much, but I genuinely think this guy had a chance. Mind you, it is slightly ludicrous that when he finally puts on the outfit he wears on the cover, he instantly develops Conan-esque muscles he hasn't had throughout the rest of the story. And there was our look at the history of Sword and Sorcery in the pages of comic books. As you can see, most of these titles didn't last too long. We looked at the complete Conan from Marvel and Dark Horse on our last program, and I feel that most of these titles didn't last because they were pretty much nothing but clones of Robert E. Howard's creation. Of course, the readers, if they were to look into something other than Conan, would want something different. The ones that truly were different had a lot going against them. Atlas Comics didn't put out more than 5 issues of any given title, and most titles were gone after 3 issues. Amethyst was a victim of circumstance, and many others that were well done and interesting had a lot going against them. However, there were a few that had staying power, such as Mike Grell's Warlord and Kull the Conqueror. What about you? Do you have a favorite Sword and Sorcery comic? Did I miss any titles that you know of? Is there a Sword and Sorcery character you think would make a great comic book adaptation? Let us all know in the comments section below. Until next time, I'm Kevin Given. For Comics, Let's Talk. Have a great day. Keep reading those comics.